Okay, welcome to the Benzo Rehab Dungeon. This is our seventh, I believe, conversation about religion and deconstruction of religion. I am joined, as always, by a friend of the show, Jacob, and we're also joined today by a very special guest, Sal from document1.doc on Instagram. Sal, how are you doing today?
I'm good. About halfway through this beer, so getting better.
Yes, always better. All right. And Jacob, how are you today?
I'm good. I'm just drinking some water with lemon peel because I had some beers last night. So
Yeah. I also had some
taking it
beers
easy
last night. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I guess what I mean is I'm not drinking beers now because I'm out of beers. If I had beers, I'd be
fair enough.
Big time toking it up.
Well, cool. So, Sal, you're here today to talk about Islam. Kind of your
writ large.
Writ large.
Right? I never want to like give anybody the idea that I am any sort of fucking how do you call it, authority on the subject of Islam.
For sure.
But I do think that well, I hope that some of the experiences that I've gone through in terms of my sort of development with religion may be interesting to the listener at this time.
And you are the one of the official listeners. Actually, you're probably the official listener.
Right, as of this month, I believe. I think that it might rotate away.
I think your picture's still up in the listener of the month.
Hell yeah!
Right, where's that? By the way, I just wanted to take a picture for my mom. Is that
it exists in the same area that the Benzo Rehab Dungeon exists in, which is nowhere.
Oh, I see. Okay.
Yeah, well, just imagine that it's there. Yeah.
Right. So yeah, I guess that's the general topic that's going to be about revolving around.
Yeah. So you were thinking the other day about how you kind of wanted to go through your story. I don't know if there's any prompt you want to have me give you or what. Maybe
honestly, I'll open it up to the
take the wheel. Take the wheel.
Oh yeah.
Should I just go ahead and do it, man?
So I think that, like, opposite to what I've usually heard on the religious deconstruction episodes, which is that usually I'll have been to like Catholic church or some sort of Sunday school or something like that, proper religious upbringing. I also had the same thing. So I was born in Baghdad in Iraq. Excuse me, I'm burpy. Baghdad in Iraq, and I came from a, like, let's say a moderately religious family. They weren't overly zealous about any of it, but they liked to discuss it and they liked to sort of follow it to as best as they can, a kind of philosophy for life. So I grew up around that, and I also grew up very close to a mosque, which isn't very difficult if you live in
no doubt.
So just around the corner was the mosque of our neighborhood, and so I even enlisted, encouraged to, but also I had the interest in the Friday school. Because Friday is the Sabbath, or at least the holy prayer day, the most holy day. And so I would, after the Friday prayer would be around noon, and after that I would stay back. And me and a bunch of kids from the neighborhood would sit around our imam. And he was a younger guy because, usually the guys who told the kids were a little younger. It was really nice to see somebody who was maybe in their 20s or 30s being like a 6-7-year-old kid who looked at a 20-year-old who looked like he kind of was put together,
What's that like?
Yeah, it's like, This guy knows what's up, right?
Yeah.
I don't know. What is it like? Maybe this is a point where I'll ask you all. Is there like? I feel like there's also something similar in the whole hot pastor type thing, where it's like if there's a young kind of.
That's Protestant shit.
Oh
Yeah,
yeah.
That's
it is
oh
very
that's
much
yeah that's
Protestant shit. Like
Protestant shit. Yeah, that doesn't
especially
happen in
like
the Catholics.
the cool hip youth pastor.
Yeah. I mean, well, because Catholics don't give a shit about fellowship, and so you don't have to worry about
Yeah.
selling with sex, whereas the Protestants are like fellowship, fellowship, fellowship.
Ah.
Yeah.
So then, who would
No,
teach you in like a Sunday school?
the priests would, but you know, typically it wouldn't be the kids thinking the priest was hot. It would be the priest thinking the kids are hot, right?
Right.
So,
I was waiting
yeah.
for something like that to come up.
Yeah,
But
no,
like,
trust me.
we're
Was
talking
gonna
about
go there.
kids and pastors.
Yeah,
There's no
yeah.
way.
Yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
I think I've demonstrated on these episodes my deep-seated love and respect for children and their value as human beings.
Yeah.
Right.
So
So
yeah,
yeah,
and
that's
go ahead. Go ahead. Sorry.
that's interesting because like that is one thing that we didn't get much of, on our side of the world, because I think because part of it is just that overall Arab society tends to be a bit more conservative about sex in general.
Mhm.
And so things of that nature are punished very heavily, right? And so I think it's like it just doesn't, like, it's such an oppressive structure in that term, which is, I would say, a good thing, that it doesn't even like, except for like, I guess, the bigger mosques with the more sort of structural kind of thing to them, it
Mhm.
didn't usually happen in like small neighborhoods.
The diddly, or what?
Sorry.
The
Yeah, no
diddling.
diddling. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, gotcha. Okay, yeah.
Uh,
Just want to make sure
especially
we're on that.
because.
Well, they keep that shit to the Bachabazi or whatever, right? And that's all to
Mhm.
Afghanistan and Pakistan. Not the Arabs. Not the Arabs. The Arabs aren't diddling kids. It's the Pashtuns and the Pakistanis.
Well, I wouldn't say any of that.
I'll
And I've
say it.
only
I
been
don't fucking
honestly
care.
okay.
I don't have a dog in the fight, and you probably don't either, because dogs are haram.
Well, if we know about some things about some people, dogs may be delicious to eat. So on and so forth.
Yeah.
I'm trying to do
But
a
any,
Barack
well,
impression.
so I'm curious. So, are you from a Sunni or Shia family?
I'm from a Sunni family.
Okay, and then because and as far as like socioeconomic status goes,
Yeah.
what, well, especially like I just don't know, like, um, Iraqi society. Like, I know Iraq has one of the largest Shia populations, right?
That's correct.
But in terms of like institutional power, um, who is it that has it? How does
So
in
this is
terms
really
of
interesting. Right. I understand what your question is in general. So, like, okay, economically speaking, our position, my family, before we left Iraq was, I would say, like lower middle class, kind of
Mhm.
upper working class. I don't even know
Mhm.
if I can really say that. The problem is these things get really hard to define once you're talking about a country that is under economic sanctions for a few decades,
Right?
because everybody's kind of poor. Like,
Yeah.
unless you are attached to the government or you are one of those old money families,
Mhm.
and there are some of them. But if you are not one of them, then kind of like either coasting by or coasting by, but it sucks. Like my family, I remember that like my mother at a certain point like took down curtains because we had these heavy like winter curtains and they were like double layered. And then what she would do is like take the one of the layers off and then make us clothes out of it,
Mm.
right? So it's like, yeah, that sounds pretty bad, but then you take in the rest of the country and it's like, well, nobody else is really doing that much, right?
Mhm.
But maybe that's also skewed because remember, or not remember, it should be acknowledged that I left Iraq by the time I was 12, right? So a lot of my memories are quite early age. So
Mhm.
that was really what was happening. What I've learned though in the process, I haven't doesn't seem to contradict my image of it. As to the Shia and the Sunni sort of split, um, it is indeed by population, I believe, upwards of, no, more than 70% of the population is Shia. But as to who has the power, you have to ask about when. Because
Right.
under
Sure.
Saddam Hussein, right, it's like the Sunnis had power, but it was also sort of, at first at least, in the beginning of the Ba'ath Party, there were ideas about secularizing the government.
Right.
So some of that also remained. But nonetheless, some oppression or suppression of the Shia population was occurring, up to and including like violence.
Right.
Um, and after the war, things changed, but changed in an erratic and decentralized way. And so you end up with these locuses of power, with like people like the Sistani or Khomeini, even these imams, religious figures of the Shia Islam sect, who play not only a religious figure but also a political and military figure, um, and even a spiritual leadership, all that kind of thing. And then there are also locuses of power that are more attached to the military, and because the old military was structured on this sort of pseudo Sunni kind of like arrangement. So there's a lot of like, basically what happens after the war is that because you take the central cornerstone of this hierarchical and just unjust government, but you take the cornerstone out and now everything's everywhere, right? But for the time being, I think we can say that the Shia population has certainly more sway in terms of not only government, but also in terms of military power, independent militia power, right?
Right.
And in terms of the religious power, then you have to take into account all the other powers around in the Middle East. So you have Iran as a locus for the Shia population, but then you also have Saudi Arabia for the Sunnis. You have Egypt also for a different kind of Sunni interpretation.
Yeah.
But you also have like Syria, which is sort of, not quite sure. And then you have Jordan, which is more Sunni, but and then you have Lebanon, which is more Shia. And so it's all kind of in a very delicate balance. I don't really know
So,
if that really answers the question.
so where did your family emigrated during or after the invasion, and I'm
Indeed.
assuming, or to where, into where?
So 2003 was the war. 2005 we left and we moved to Egypt.
Okay.
And then we lived there for about 3 years, and then we moved to Malaysia and lived there for about 4 years. But the emigration was also a kind of way for me to reinterpret and re-understand Islam. Because from the Friday school of like the little neighborhood where we lived, excuse me, Egypt and Cairo specifically, where the sort of it's simultaneously more secular because there's stuff like shopping malls, so it's a bit more, and even like Hollywood movies were there all the time. People dressed in a fashion that was a little bit more liberalized than what you would have in Iraq, especially after the war, because let's say 2005 or 2004 until possibly now, the country had gotten way further back in terms of their ideas about practicing Islam and how people should wear and behave and so on. So
But then it's
Egypt was
also like, I mean, but it's also like the birthplace of the Muslim Brotherhood, right? And like Saeed Qutb was there.
Yes,
and,
exactly.
He's batshit insane. Well, yeah, being a little dismissive, but batshit insane.
Right. No, I think most reasonable people would say that he had some problematic ideas.
Cancelable.
Cancelable for sure.
Yeah.
Well, and he got canceled too.
He did.
Didn't he try and take out he tried to take out Nasser or whatever? And
God. Yeah,
I don't even know. I can't remember, but yeah. Anyway, sorry.
It's a whole thing as well. But indeed, you're pointing in the right direction, because indeed, while there's more sort of liberalized and westernized in a specific way, it is also more sort of focused in terms of the zealous part of
Right.
the Muslims there.
Well,
It grows strongly.
and that was his whole intellectual trajectory as well, because he was educated here and lived here for quite some time, and just was like so kind of disgusted by, you know, Western decadence. Yeah, exactly. And you know,
And rightfully so, probably.
oh sure, yeah, but like you know, I mean, it's I mean, that's kind of like that's the jumping off point though. That's where the critique of the Salafists and the Wahhabists stops being reasonable, where it's like, man, you guys are fucked up, let's blow you up. And it's like, well, I don't know.
You see, I think that there's an argument to be made that if it's like almost a counterfactual of history, that if there was a sort of anti-imperialist tradition that had sort of arisen in the Middle East to sort of give an alternative to anti-imperialism purely through Islam, or purely through the sort of this kind of religious jihad sort of interpretation, then you wouldn't have had so many problems with it. But indeed, what happens is a lot of these people go out to study in Europe or in the US, and then realize that, yeah, like, not only are these guys more developed, but also they seem to have completely like lost that thing, right? Which they are seeing in their own sort of home countries getting lost. And what they, I guess, from my perspective, what they fail to understand is that what is being lost isn't necessarily a kind of faith in religion, and more a faith in community. And the sort of obsessive capitalist kind of engagement is almost as it becomes a antidote for the rot that sort of settles in when community falters. So it's because that ends up that's what ends up happening in the Middle East, is that as it westernizes and as it sort of opens up, it also starts to engage more heavily with commerce, right? And starts gets invested in and so on, and ends up in this loop. And that's how, as far as I could tell, how these kind of intensifications ended up happening. More secularization on one end that tries to engage with the sort of individualist self-creation in capitalism, versus, on the other hand, the communitarian kind of religious bonding. So both of them escalate at the same time. And so you end up with a place like that would have really nice malls and cinemas with like 13 screens all playing Hollywood movies, and also the Muslim Brotherhood.
Yeah. Well, I mean, also that's kind of a funny thing. So when I was in college, you know, so I went to Ohio State, and Columbus, Ohio has a relatively high Somali population. So you would see these girls walking around in hijab, but they would then also have like designer bags. And it's just this really stark literal image, because it's this, you know, just purely religious kind of iconography. And then, well, not purely religious maybe, but
right,
you know, well, because
that's another thing, right? Because indeed for us, like, you know, like, especially when before I started moving out of the Middle East, I mean, hijab and whatnot is not, you don't see it as religious. It's just what people wear, right?
Right. Yeah.
And if you think
it's also like, I mean, hijab, you know, to me it's kind of like similar to you know, Leviticus propositions or prescriptions about eating shellfish. It's like if you're in the fucking desert, it's probably not a good idea to eat shellfish, because it's probably not, you know, refrigerated properly, right? If you're fucking Iron Age tribal culture. Same thing with a fucking hijab. It's like, hey man, the sun's out all the time. What should I do? Cover the fuck up, you know? Like, you know what I mean? Like,
yeah.
as much as possible.
There are these perfectly materialist explanations for these things that even like libs who drool over justifying them don't go to. It's just like, well, no, that's their religion. It's like, yeah, but it's
Right.
really not, because Jews and Christian women in the Middle East, or I don't know, maybe not so much the Jewish women, but Christian women do as well, I think,
Yeah,
right?
to an extent, but also there are like sort of little, almost you would say little rules of etiquette, really, if you want to
Mm-hmm.
interpret it in a sort of Western way, that would tell you whether this is being done as a practicality towards culture, a practicality towards the environment, or a religious observance. Like, for example, one of those little rules is, especially if you're coming from a moderate to more strict Muslim family, is how whether the hijab covers all of the hair that is on them,
Mm-hmm.
right? Because some women will wear it and then it will kind of like peel back a little bit, and there'll be like a tuft of hair that will just be poking out. And some communities don't view that as a big deal, like Iranian women, especially as expats, often do this. But on the other hand, like more religious communities, especially if you're talking about in Iraq or Egypt, um, will view this as a sign of like almost slight disobedience or rebellion. And
Mm-hmm.
so some women go out of their way to make sure completely that all of their hairs are tucked in, right? That's on one hand. On the other hand, in terms of the heat, most of what I heard from the women that I knew, extended family and friends and all of that, is it's really sucks to wear a hijab in the summer
Right. Yeah,
because
of
it's
course. Yeah.
fucking hot and humid
Yeah.
and it just blows, right? But I can see your interpretation, especially in terms of the usual sort of dress, in the sense
Mm-hmm.
of it's usually loose and baggy, open and airy, and also even the men have a sort of head guard that doubles as a face
Mm-hmm.
mask or face guard, because especially in the desert, when nomadology was still a thing, this is where this was like an essential piece of equipment. Let's put it that way. So
Well, another
indeed,
thing
but
about facial covering, as somebody who's been to the Middle East, when those sandstorms kick up, like you want something over your fucking mouth.
Yeah.
um,
it sucks if you
yeah,
don't have
yeah.
something like
I
even
stood
without like a
post.
sandstorm.
I stood post in Camp Leatherneck, facing the western part of Kandahar province, which, if you know anything about that region, is just a dust bowl. And so yeah, it was like every day around noon, I was like, and here we're masking up, we're putting some goggles on because I won't be able to breathe or see for the next like 2 hours. And I
Yep.
was always,
Yep.
this is just a weird aside, but I was always paranoid that that was when somebody was gonna sneak up on my post and kill me because I couldn't see like more than 5 feet away from my fucking post. So it was always like a
Oh
paranoid
man.
time where I'm like huddled in the corner, like keeping an eye on the
Right.
door and like,
Right.
but
Oh,
yeah, having a facial covering is incredibly important when you're having to deal with sandstorms.
that's really interesting because I remember also that as a kid, at least, in Iraq, whenever there was sandstorms or whenever there was just low visibility, that's when we knew you gotta fucking stay inside because those soldiers out there are now on their nerves. You do not want any movement in their periphery, right? So, in a sense, I guess, both people are kind of hiding from each other, be like, oh, please don't come
Oh, for
here.
sure, yeah.
But indeed, yes. Like if sand is kicking up, even if it's not a sandstorm. Like I remember some summers, our playground in our school, right, would be just kind of unbearable to sort of breathe in, just because it's hot and sand is just kind of around. It's kind of like the dust, right? So you just breathe and you feel this like particulate getting into your sinuses, right?
Yeah. Not
So
to have
yeah,
like a Star Wars moment or anything like that, but I hate sand. It gets everywhere.
Oh boy. Whew.
Yeah.
see,
But no,
yeah,
even with like a face covering, like I would remember like blowing my nose come out like black and like also like blood and stuff because of all the nosebleeds from dryness
yeah,
and yeah.
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 Yeah. So indeed, that is sort of like the whole hijab thing. That's how we go.
Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, there's in terms of like how I felt about it once I got to Egypt, and then I saw like um, the more let's say extreme aspects of Islam in this specific direction. Because what happened in Iraq is the schism happened after the war, in terms of the civil war that happened between Sunnis and Shias, which would go on between 2006 and 2008 or nine. Um, I wasn't there for that, but I felt it before it happened, because these things don't just pop up out of nowhere.
Of
And
course.
of course, I had family there, right? But then in Egypt, what we saw is that we felt the intensification of people's displeasure with Mubarak.
Mhm.
And Mubarak at the time was sort of, it seemed like he was setting up his sons to take over, which is completely not surprising for these dictators. Saddam was basically doing the same thing with his sons. And one of the places in which this dissatisfaction voiced itself the most strongly is within places like the, excuse me, Muslim Brotherhood, right? And so you feel the unrest, and you feel this kind of intensification or radicalization of people. And me, as like a 12-year-old until I was 15, really disliked that, because what comes with that is a set of beliefs about how the performance of religion is actually what's important, right? The
Mhm.
shift of what becomes important becomes more about sort of falling in line, because your
Comportment.
community, exactly, because you need, you need a sort of obedient um, structure, not only from the government who wants to suppress, but also from the oppositions which want to oppose in a specific way, who are very careful not to sort of fall into the wrong kind of opposition. For the Muslim Brotherhood, or for people who are adjacent to or thinking about it in Islamic ways, that would be, secular, westernized revolution, right? So there's all these forces playing out. Me as a 12 to 15-year-old, I'm just like, why are y'all being so fucking obsessive about this, right? Like it starts to me to feel like it's more about the performance than it is about truly engaging with the ideas that faith, and specifically Islam, brings up. Because none of these religions are final, right? You always have to reinterpret. You always have to cross out some things or look for new solutions in the same text, which is what those scholars are supposed to do, as long as we are talking about keeping the religion alive. But
Mhm.
because you have these conflicts, some people want to preserve it, and in that preservation, it dies. Um, so I hated all that. And I think it is within Egypt that I truly decided that I was quitting, right?
Mm.
Not only quitting religion, and specifically Islam, but also quitting faith.
Mm.
This is when my biggest doubts about God, and about even the sort of structure of the universe as I was taught it,
Mhm.
um, was sort of pronouncing himself the most. Um, and that was also a crisis of identity, because at the same time that I was losing my religion, I was also losing my place as a sort of, maybe let's say, Iraqi, right? Like
Mhm.
my connection to my nationality, or my connection to my internal sort of set of beliefs and thoughts. Um, so that was an interesting time to go through, where you sort of like, all of your borders, all of the things that seem to define you, they start melting away, and you end up in this kind of open space where you have to figure it out for yourself.
That's
Mhm.
interesting that you bring that up because um like I had always had doubts when I was a kid about my faith in Christianity. And then I kind of refocused on that, and then, I joined the military. When I really started to lose that again was going to Afghanistan, and like just having this like disillusionment with everything that I was participating in.
Yeah.
And like you're saying, where yeah, I lost like my identity as like a United States Marine was like nothing I wanted to be a part of anymore, and like the boundaries of who I was evaporate. And when I started um questioning my faith again, in a more final way, I think, um And so yeah, this is interesting to hear you talk about this because I think you brought up the other day when we were talking about this that you sort of identify as a Muslim now, or is that
Yeah, I
incorrect?
wouldn't even say that. What happened is like this is literally within this month. I was having a conversation with a friend and I realized that I actually would like to believe in a God again, would like to have a personal relationship with a kind of faith.
Sure.
But I very immediately, as soon as I realized this, I also realized this has nothing to do with Islam
Okay.
or Christianity. But I see those as sort of like signposts, perhaps. Like, reading the Bible, I cannot help but think that there's something here, right? Something very old and something very wise.
it,
Something
it
that
it's
taps, yeah,
it's just a way of engaging with the world, I think. Because I think I experience something similar on a regular basis where, like it's, the sort of fundamentalist understanding of either being agnostic or atheist is that you're certain and that you're like comfortable in that, and it's not like, or Freud called religious faith the oceanic feeling, like there is a or it's the sublime, there are a range of human experiences, um that might be interpersonal, they might be an experience of nature, it might be something as simple as eating something that tastes really good, that uh, we do not have the kind of purely experiential capacity or language or vocabulary to define. And so naturally, on like kind of a long enough evolutionary timeline, of course it makes sense that that would go or would have gone to the divine. um, but then if you don't have um, uh, belief in or relation to a god who is like kind of the linchpin or fulcrum of that divine experience, then it is profoundly alienating, because at that point you're just looking into a void. And so, I mean, like I tend to joke that like I'm a cultural Catholic, in the same way that secular Jews will say, or that they're culturally Jewish, or secular Jews, and I feel the same way, because I mean there are values that I was agnostic from the get, but went to Catholic school from kindergarten, grew up going to church, was baptized, blah blah blah, but it never felt. I mean, to me, the problem is that like I'm perfectly willing and eager, frankly, even to accept that kind of range of experience, that you are experiencing something which does exceed the bounds of human cognition or understanding. Um, but then it comes down to, well, why is it the Abrahamic God? Why would it be Kali or Shiva or or Hura Mazda, or you know what I mean? Like it goes down to, why is it this? For me, like I understand in terms of like an anthropological reasoning why it is XYZ, but for me it's just like I would much rather just have it not be codified and be like, oh yeah, Yahweh, rock on, brother,
right, right, right.
um but
I
yeah, it
think I
is it.
think I love your interpretation of that in the sense that they are a bunch of pre-made or ready-made codes that you can start interpreting your feeling of God, your feeling of community, your feeling of love for humanity, whatever it is. You interpret it through those lenses, and basically, whatever God you end up on is mostly going to be just a matter of where were you born, but then
Mm-hmm.
also, if you're able to break from that, what inspires you, right?
Yeah.
Which of these stories sound like your story?
Mm-hmm.
Do I have that about right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I think, and especially too, part of what's so frustrating for me, just within Catholicism and Christianity more generally, it's more a problem with American evangelicalism is just the divorce from, well, one, with evangelical Christianity, it's essentially a cult of personality around the figure of Christ, um, which we've talked about on some of these episodes. But then also the politics of these people is so profoundly unchrist-like,
Oh, for
like
sure.
willfully unchrist-like. Like if you were to say, well, Jesus did XYZ, they would say, wow, that's great, Jesus rocks. And then if you say, well, what about a political party that does XYZ, and be like, that's un-American, you know. So I find, you know, in the figure of Christ, I place a great deal of stock in like the values that he, according to Scripture, stood for. But it's the same that I would say, you know, I like someone like any other philosopher. It's like, you know, it's a philosophy. Like there's no, oh, I must worship this figure. It's, you know, these are sort of perennial propositions that are kind of, that should be, you know, timeless and true, and hopefully, you know, even if you're not attempting to act in comportment with Scripture, generally speaking, I think good behavior, it would wind up being in comportment with what world scriptures say is good behavior. You know what I mean? Like,
yeah,
you don't have to be. Well, go ahead.
Yeah, all I was gonna say is like, you could take this to the logical extreme and be like, so do you think like, I don't know, human sacrifices in a specific scripture, and does that? No, of course not. But to be sort of reasonable about this, and to approach this in a way that is sort of staying to our human spirit in a way, and not to sound too Hegelian about this, but like the way that, let's make this more personal perhaps so I can describe it better. The way that I feel my God now is almost as a solution to the problem of me wanting to love humanity but feeling so absolutely doomed within the current situation.
Mm-hmm.
And so I want to hope, but I don't feel like hoping is really anything but naive. So unless I embody it with the complete naivete of a creator that looks and sees and maybe judges, right? Then I can't, it seems like I can't hold on to that hope without a certain amount of pain, without a certain amount of needing to sort of absurdify it in a certain way. So by taking it all the way to the end and just be like, oh, there's a God, right? And that's why I believe, because God exists. And so even if we fail on this plane, there's still a God who somehow can reset things, or a God who simply witnesses. Because at the very least, the fact that there is a witness to my suffering, right, is enough as a kind of, as a balm for some really hard days, right? Like that's all I need sometimes, is just kind of just being like, are you seeing this shit? Like, you know, and that's enough. I don't need a response simply by expelling it. I have enough of it.
Yeah, I actually, you know, it's funny. I had a friend in college who was a Catholic, and she sort of had the same thing. Like, she literally just said, you know, like, I'm comforted by the idea that there's someone up there who loves me, which I don't know. It's kind of like,
I just call them the CIA now.
Yeah, right. Yeah. I just,
there's
I don't
somebody
know.
watching me.
Yeah, I
CIA boyfriend.
Yeah, right. They're an intersectional millennial with generalized anxiety disorder.
Yes.
No, but I don't know. I truly you know, the idea of a God that is somehow analogous to human cognition or personality is kind of, to me, I can't, you know, because I mean, just on a purely like logical level, you know, like assuming that there is this supernatural power that created
Oh
us,
yes.
to say that this being whose life span is the same as the temporal horizon of the universe, that they have the same drives as us is ludicrous. And
Of
like, I
course.
guess, so you brought up Hegel, so I'm gonna go to Spinoza, in the whole thing of the univocity, of what is said of God is said of man, just it's a matter of intensity or degree. So when someone says God is good, it's not God is good in a way that's gooder than man. It's God is good in at the level of like 100 degrees, and man is good at the level of 50 degrees. But even then, it's like, well, so that kind of proposition still just assumes that God's being is intelligible to us. And so you're just tracing human cognition and human beingness onto the divine, which to me, I'm
Right.
like, man, I'd rather just fucking worship the sun or a storm god, because that makes more sense. To like, these elemental primordial forces to me are far more like, you know that's what deserves
Well, that kind of seems
propitiation.
to be how religion formed, like in the
Right.
beginning, right?
Yeah, yeah, and then there's a refinement to these kind
Yeah.
of
There's
anthropomorphized.
like an abstraction from the sun god into being like um the god of ancient Judea, which is obviously morphed from old perceptions of like worshiping the sun, because God is seen as like a glowing light sort of figure. um but then yeah, it changes into something that's more like I mean, almost like bureaucratized, right? like,
Mhm.
like now,
Well,
it's
okay.
not just the sun. Now it's the sun has a bunch of rules that you have to follow.
Yeah.
And
Right, right, right. I will provide a different interpretation. And
yeah,
this is
go
not to
ahead.
say that I disagree with you guys, because I actually mostly do, but I like to add few more points, because indeed I think that if Lovecraft's best contribution is narrativizing the idea of a being that powerful is not only not good in terms of our
Right.
species for our survival, but also it is possibly even imperceptible,
Mhm.
because its perception would drive us insane. So the human mind
Right.
simply cancels it out. But I think that it's very difficult to imagine what the world will be like after uh, you're dead, right? It's difficult to imagine how people will simply move on, and not only does the world carry on, but it carries on brilliantly, right? Like
Mhm.
sometimes we like to think that the world would get to shit, and like gonna see the best that it's gonna be for another 300 years. But let's say by some accounts, that's maybe there will be a better world after us. But even then, in order for that to happen, people have to believe enough to try and create that world. And some way of doing that is to sort of humanize the god in such a way that it becomes not only human but a transcendence of humanity that we
Mhm.
could get to if we were to be human, if you see what I mean, right? So
Mhm.
it's like a hope with a horizon, where it's
Mhm.
like and a definite point that constantly moves forward as you get to it, right?
Mhm.
um, and I would say that even like innovations in religion, like the Trinity, are super interesting to think about, because in their sort of puzzle box kind of paradox type idea,
Oh,
right? Where
it's
it's
just
like
kind of
it's
like early metaphysics, right? Like
right, exactly. Where it's like you're starting to probe the idea of maybe things aren't just as simple as a song. Maybe things are actually as complicated as a human and a god and the thing between them, right? And then like a birth without a father, right? Like you're starting to disentangle these hierarchies and fucking around with them. which I think is also lost if we are to simply simplify the trajectory of these things as just we're just trying to you know imagine something beyond, right? Or imagine or the other thing, imagining a imaginary friend who's looking out for you, making sure that everything's
Mhm.
nice.
Yeah, I mean, I do think I think that's an interesting point of this kind of uh, the I don't even know what the word would be, ameliorative qualities of like cosmology or having a cosmological system, because I think that is truly like there is something to be said for this kind of visceral reaction that people have to Western secularism of like, this is so, obviously there is just sort of the culture shock aspect of it, but there is a spiritual reaction. I mean, like, we just live in a culturally deadening uh society. Like, it's just not, there's not much that speaks to the soul if one exists.
It's neoliberalism, bro.
Yeah, I guess.
Honestly, that's what I kind of see as being like the primary issue, and why Western culture sucks so much is because it's this extraction form of like taking everything and kind of just mushing it together into like a gray paste that doesn't have any flavor or like spirituality to it, and like I think it's interesting to hear that Sal has, and I misinterpreted what you said the other day where you said that you were returning to faith in some form. I thought that
No
meant
problem,
that you're
brother.
returning to Islam, but I think the three of us probably some form or another have reached like an understanding of how important spirituality is. Obviously, not the spiritualities that we were fed as children. That we see a lot of harm in, or whatever.
yeah.
Um, the return to spirituality, and in my own life, as I'm like driving people nuts, I talk to them, start going on insatiable tangents about just the state of the world and whatnot, and how much
Right.
like we are divorced like a good nature of living and being, and it's really all got to do with culture, and yeah,
I will
like
say, right? I want to interject here and say again, and this is only just because I love kind of trying to look on the bright side of life, as stupid and as trite as that is. I feel like one of the problems that we have with neoliberalism is that we are kind of stuck in a realism of it as well as a capitalist realism, where
Yeah.
we're constantly just like not seeing the way out of this individualization, not seeing a way out of this atomization. How do you put the pieces back together? But then one has to admit that even under the most drab, bland, neoliberal places of all time, aka the UK, there have been these beacons of like true spirituality within the self, right? Like I would point to like Burial, the sort of jungle
Hmm. Yeah.
dubstep drum and bass kind of artist.
Garage.
Yes.
Yeah.
Uh,
He's
and
great.
Burial is great. And those first two albums, he explores a space where he's sort of almost creating a communion with the
Hmm.
generation just before him, right? And seeing kind of like God in the memories, and sort of God in those moments of euphoria in the midst of this darkness, right? Or at least that's one of the ways that I interpret it. And what I
Hmm.
mean is that pieces of art created like this, and it's sort of truly the deepest, darkest sort of moments of the soul, can still reach towards a understanding that there is an ascendance to this, and it comes through not only respecting this new vision of the person that we have found, but also going past it and sort of trying to see how can we maximize that freedom through a kind of coordination, right?
Yeah.
At least
When I
that's what
think
one hopes.
yeah, and I think, but and to me, what's powerful about something like that is the way in which it, you know, talking about the atomization of the self, or the kind of, I mean, the professionalization of everyday life, the medicalization of everyday life, that we are supposed to understand ourselves often in like these clinical and professional terms, and then there is the reaction to that reaction is, you know, sort of new age woo woo, where, you know, I'm XYZ, and it's like, no, you're not. Like, you're just not. But like, I'm profoundly, and I've always been profoundly interested in systems of thought that try to bracket the degree to which Western subjectivity is funneled through the ego, you know. And I mean, this is why I was always attracted to Deleuze, the philosopher, you know, was because that's what his thought was about. But and I think that I mean, especially something like burial, or that kind of music, you know, there is, I mean, for me, it would usually more so be like something like black metal. There is just this capacity that sound has to, because it's almost like by being so like being so stimulated, it kind of creates this little resonance chamber in the self. um and I mean, like, some of the most like transcendent experiences I've had have been at shows, you know, where it's just like crushing sound and you can't fucking hear anything, you can barely hear what you're listening to, and it's just like that, you know, this is it, you're dialed in. And it's, I mean, it's the same thing, it's carnivalesque almost, really. um which, you know, obviously the problem with carnival is after carnival everything goes back to the way it was. But, you know, yeah, I mean, I think, you know, I think, yeah, art is one of those things that has that capacity. I think, yeah, I would say usually music, probably cinema. You know, I don't know. I mean, it's
Sure.
kind
Yeah.
of, but the, yeah, I mean, in terms of imagining ways out, I don't even know, man. I mean, because I generally, like, to go back to Lovecraft, you know, my attitude is pretty much like, you know, life, biological carbon-based life is such a blip. It's not even a blip on the radar of the ultimate cosmic scale. So it's my attitude right now, and I'm sure this will change at some point, but it's just like, I'm just kind of like, I just don't really care. Like, I can't be brought to care, because it's like this, like, there's a, to me, there's just like sort of a hubris of like being like, we should try to figure this out, like, you know, which, you know, it's not like, oh yeah, it's fine that you know, the US does what it does, or that capital does what it does, but it's also just like, it's just, it literally just like, who fucking cares, man? Like,
Right. Right. Right.
this is going to end in a very real way, you know, before even the ultimate heat death of the universe. Like, the before the universe ends, life will have been ended for uncountable amounts of time. You know, like,
Exactly. Exactly. And
like,
so, like, just trying to imagine that kind of boggles your mind like that, and you
yeah,
struggle to find the words for it because it's just so incredibly unhuman, right? Like, in
right,
this exact Lovecraftian sense, in the sense of like, not only does it exceed human lifetimes, it exceeds the lifetime of humanity. And it
Mhm.
exceeds it by such an amount that a comparison of those amounts is incredibly difficult to try and imagine. And that, I think, is why the idea of God is so compelling to me, because
Yeah.
it is essentially that image of a human beyond all that.
Mhm.
And then how
Yeah.
do we get there? Almost as a challenge of humanity to sort of ascend to that level. And of course,
Yeah.
religion does very much gesture towards that, is that like, the more pious you are, the closer you are to God. Um, but I believe, I guess, if there's one thing that I believe is worthwhile in all of that, it is that kind of call to ascend,
Mhm.
call to escape, call to go beyond what like the human as an evolutionary product is, and achieve a kind of human as a metaphysical force that
Mhm.
can exist beyond space and time.
Geist.
Now,
It's
right.
interesting that you're bringing all this up because you also participate very heavily in the Trincata workshop, and one of our reading assignments was Leotard's "Can Thought Go On Without a Body?"
Yes,
So very on topic to what we've both been reading recently.
indeed. That's exactly why I was thinking about it too,
Yeah.
because it all kind of, I guess, in a way, because even specifically in that piece, I feel there's at the very beginning, Leotard starts with this ramble about philosophers. Oh, you ask these questions that have no end, and meanwhile, you're forgetting the question of human survival should be at the forefront of your thought. And I feel that is a question or a damnation that we can target at a lot of religious institutions that have failed us as people, as humans,
Mhm.
because they're so obsessed with ideas of conquest or ideas of spreading the word or whatever, and forgetting the central problem, which is how do you make sure that people go on, right? How do you make sure that God's creation goes on? Because without people, then the word of God dies. I don't think aliens are going to read the Bible, right? So
They
it's
might.
gotta, they might, they might, but it's gotta be us. And so if it's gotta be us, then that kind of line of thinking, that kind of how to say progressive kind of
Mhm.
approach to it, I feel is perhaps at least an avenue that the left writ large is sort of experiencing anyway. Like this interest in esotericism, this interest in like demon shit and all that Tumblr witchcraft shit also. Like all of it is just coming from this idea that there's got to be more. There's got to be more. This isn't enough, right? I'm not getting my kicks.
Yeah.
I agree. Yeah.
Well, and I mean, especially, it's the poverty of life that, well, the poverty of life and a testament to the bullshit failure of any sort of cultural revolution or awakening that supposedly happened in the post-war context in America, post World War II, 60s, whatever. Like, you know, that preceded just a global reaction, which has, like, yeah, neoliberalism is the word that people have decided that describes that, but it's a spiritual impoverishment. It's
Absolutely.
a conceptual impoverishment. It's an impoverishment of material life, um, and so, naturally, yeah, of course, people are going to go to this kind of the Tumblr witch, whatever, the new age. I need this crystal to tell me what color shirt to wear, whatever the fuck. Um, but yeah, I mean, but the thing for me always is periodize, periodize, periodize. So it's like that's just the moment we're in right now, um, which isn't to say it's invalid. It's just it is just that to me there always does need to be a caveat of you know this is profoundly historical, within our own lifetimes. It will change as we experience it or as other people experience it. Obviously, we'll always be right because you know that's just how it is. But yeah, I don't know. I'm just like, I don't know.
It is all indeed. It is all too human, right?
It's
It's
yeah,
all so.
it's all an accident of history.
Yeah, yeah, and perhaps in a way, I think I'm coming to realize that I wouldn't want to have it any other way. Like the mess of it, the blood of it, the
Mhm.
even the shame of it, right? Like it all just seems to fit. Like I used to be an idealist who wanted pure transcendence, pure, like when I was religious, I was pious to the T. And in fact, I feared learning new religious rules because I knew that I would have to follow them. And
Mhm.
so I tried as much as I can to limit my knowledge just so I don't realize just how much more I need to do because I was that committed. I was like, well, once I know it, I need to do it. Right. Because that is how much I wanted to get closer to it. Right. And now that, I'm 27 as opposed to, I don't know, 7. And I'm starting to realize I want the same thing, but I want it to be about people. I want
Mhm.
to believe in people in such a ridiculous, naive way because a kind of disenchanted way of looking at it, a world where, indeed, as they have created it, a place of like pure personal competition, a place of pure commerce, right? That is a world that is completely devoid. And on that, we all agree.
Mhm.
So I want to believe there's not only something else, but that we will get to it at some point.
Mhm.
And if climate catastrophe has to happen and 70% of the population needs to go in order for the other 30% to realize the mistake and reformat the world, then by all means, I just hope that they do something better than what we've done.
Yeah.
Pretty low bar. So we're going a little bit long for the religious deconstruction episode. I think Sal, we probably like to have you back sometime. I think this has been a very
Yeah,
interesting and good
for sure.
conversation. Not a whole lot of talk about Islam, but I think that's okay. I think we had a productive conversation regardless. So thank you both for joining me today.
Thank
Yeah,
you for having me. I had a great
of course.
time,
Yeah,
and
yeah. We'll set it up again, for sure.
sure.
Um, yeah. I don't really have a sign off for this except for keep living, take your medicine. All
That's
Take mine
great.
too.
right.
Yeah.
Hi, Michael Deebs here, with no gun pointed at my head. Please know that all content created for the Benzo Rehab Dungeon is and always will be freely available. However, if you would like to support this creation of content, we here at Camp Benzo would appreciate it, as the production itself is not free of cost. Anything donated will go to covering the various subscription fees maintained for content production or improving and expanding the content produced. If you are able to, please head on over to patreon.com/benzorehabdungeon. We also have shirts for sale on Teespring, all priced as low as we can get them without turning much or any profit. They are mostly so that you can show your loved ones that a necessary intervention may be on the horizon. Links to the merchandise storefront and our various social media profiles can be found on our link tree, which is the word link tr.ee/benzo rehab dungeon. As always, we love you. Please take your medicine.